Hello, I'm Dr. Wayne Riley, Chair of the Board of Trustees of the New York Academy of Medicine and President of SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. Thank you for joining us today for our Around the Table series, where we discuss issues related to health equity, the heart of our mission with specific relevance to the times we are living in today. As we all know, discussion and exchange of information is critical, but so is taking action. After each program, we offer resources and recommend action steps you can take, all so you can engage and help move us closer to our shared mission to advance health equity. Today's program is going to be slightly different than what we've done in the past. Instead of a roundtable conversation, we will be presenting a one-on-one discussion with Dr. Judith Salerno, our president, and our special guest, Dr. Peter Hotez, an internationally recognized physician scientist in neglected tropical diseases and vaccine development, and professor of pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine, where, among other things, he is also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. They will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 and the related vaccines on our nation's children. We hope that while you listen in, you will be thinking about how you can take action, because making meaningful change will take all of us working together. Thank you again for joining us today. And now please join me in welcoming New York Academy of Medicine's President, Dr. Judith Salerno, and our special guest, Dr. Peter Hotez.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Peter Hotez as we discuss what we can do to protect our children against COVID-19. Let's start the discussion by looking at a few statistics. According to the CDC, the rate of coronavirus infections among children has recently topped those of adults and seniors for the very first time in this pandemic. And that, of course, is driven by the Delta variant. The September 30th, 2021 joint report of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Children's Hospital Association shows that the cumulative number of child COVID-19 cases is almost 5.9 million, 16.2% of all recorded cases in the US. Last week alone, children represented 26.7% of the weekly reported cases, an increase of over 7% over the previous 2 weeks. Dr. Hotez, can you put this increasing number of children infected with COVID-19 into perspective? What should be our main priorities, and what are the challenges we face?
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Salerno. It's good to see you again, even though it's virtually. I still, in many ways, think of myself as a New Yorker. I did my MD, PhD in New York at Rockefeller and Cornell, and met my wife in New York, so I feel very New Yorky. Miss it a lot. So looking forward to seeing you again.
We'll take you back at any time.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the pediatric cases are very alarming, as well as the hospitalizations. I think that includes about 30,000 pediatric hospitalizations, and by the way, 500 deaths. So more than we would typically see in an influenza year. So this is serious stuff, and it's important to highlight, and this is why this session is so critical, because the narrative that's out there is that COVID-19 exclusively causes severe illness in those over the age of 60 or 70 or 80, and it's simply not true. It never was true. And the Delta variant has exposed that, because what's happened here in the South, where I am, where you have so many unvaccinated people, that just gave a lot of momentum to the Delta variant. It was like a hurricane over warm water, having so many vaccinated people. And I don't think the virus is necessarily targeting kids. I think what's happening is, whether you call it a hurricane or a firestorm, kids are getting swept up in it. And that's why you're seeing so many hospitalizations and a lot of sick kids. And that's really distressing. So here in the South, we're starting to see children's hospitals fill up over the summer. And for the first time that I can remember, pediatric ICUs, pediatric intensive care units, getting overwhelmed. So we have all heard about the ICUs getting overwhelmed, but not pediatric ICUs. And that's really heartbreaking. So this has clearly become a major problem. certainly because of the hospitalizations and deaths. But, the other big unknown piece to this is the long COVID piece. And I think that's the great mystery that we really don't have answered. We have some numbers among young adults, 26% of young adults can get long COVID. But we don't know how that number goes as we get younger and younger. It still remains understudied. And here's the single thing that worries me the most. And it was a study based out of the UK among adults. And, the UK is such an efficient health system, or national health system. They had 40,000 brain scans on file. And then so that when individuals were infected with COVID, they can bring them back and rescan. So it's almost like a perfect study. And they were able to show significant gray matter degeneration, cognitive declines that resembled individuals who are much older, even Alzheimer's disease. This was an Alzheimer's research group done at Oxford University who did the study. The big question is all of those individuals were over the age of 40. The question is what happens with the little kids, whose brains are growing and developing, or the adolescents. Is there a similar cognitive decline? Is there similar gray matter brain degeneration? Does it come back? None of those things we really understand. And I think, the message is we need to turn our pediatric neurologists, our child psychiatrists, our experts in neuroscience onto this problem and begin looking at it now in order to get answers. And it also changes the equations in terms of why we vaccinate, because so much of the emphasis is around vaccination, around preventing hospitalizations and deaths. And I'm saying, no, we want to vaccinate to prevent COVID-19 because we want to prevent long COVID, including our kids.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. Is there anybody in this country who's systematically looking at these kids and their infections and following them longitudinally? Because it seemed like we missed the boat early in the pandemic with adults.
I would imagine the NIH is looking into this, in the National Institute of Neurologic Diseases, National Institutes of Mental Health, or Child Health and National Institute of Child Health and Development. But I don't know exactly who's doing what. It sounds like it may be a bit fragmented at this point, but it's going to be absolutely critical to get a full understanding of this, and because so many kids, especially in our unvaccinated areas in the South and the Mountain West, have become infected. We need to know what to expect and how to monitor them, how to follow them longitudinally, and maybe there are things we can do to intervene.
Yeah, and it seems that that the emphasis, as you noted, is still on vaccinating, and it by the end of the month, perhaps we'll be seeing the availability of vaccinations for kids over the age of 5. But is vaccinating our kids the way out of this pandemic for all of us?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. One is we need to vaccinate kids to prevent them from getting COVID and to prevent them from getting sick. And the Delta variant has taught us why we need to do that, because, just on the basis of pediatric morbidity and hospitalizations, and now I'm worried about long COVID, we need to do that. But I also am of the opinion that we also need to prevent infection in the kids, that it's not a benign illness in kids. And then lastly, it's an added piece to fully vaccinating the American people, because, Judy, the bar is high, with a variant that's this transmissible. When you're talking about reproductive numbers of 6, 7, or 8, what that means is you need 80 to 90% of the population vaccinated in order to halt transmission. And that's a pretty high bar. And people say we'll never do that. Well, I disagree. We can, and we have, right? We do it every year for polio and for measles and diphtheria and pertussis and tetanus. We need to do it for COVID-19, although we don't have the luxury of waiting for that ecosystem to evolve and do it now. So we need to vaccinate the kids in order to interrupt transmission. But the point that I want to make is one of the messages that you see coming out of the anti-vaccine groups is that they're saying we need to vaccinate in order to kids to protect the adults, and questioning the risk-benefit ratio or questioning the merits of vaccinating kids. And that's just anti-vaccine disinformation. It's not true. We need to vaccinate the kids because we need to vaccinate the kids. We need to prevent them from getting sick.
Yeah, we know that the vaccine hesitant adults who are parents are going to be hesitant about vaccinating their kids. But what I'm hearing anecdotally are that some parents who have been vaccinated have concerns about side effects for their kids. And what are we going to do to reassure those parents? How can we extend our knowledge and help them make this decision for their children?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I'm following here is the vaccination rates among the 12 to 17-year-olds, since we have no experience in this. And you see a wide variation by geography. So up in the north, you're looking at 65 to 80% or more of the adolescents are vaccinated. Whereas down here in the south, we're looking at 25 to 40%. So half or even a third as much. And what that tells me is the same parents who are hesitant to vaccinate their adolescents are probably going to be hesitant to vaccinate their little kids, maybe more so. So we're going to see very few young kids vaccinated in the South, whereas up in the North, I think it'll be much better accepted. The FDA has been very cautious about this. They've asked the companies and most recently it's going to be Pfizer, because they're for Pfizer BioNTech, they're going to be the first to apply to add additional studies into kids to look at several thousand kids for that. It's not the same as what's going to happen afterwards, though, which is that a pretty detailed system of pharmacovigilance is going to be in place, because even with the large trials, you don't always pick up rare safety signals. But I think, the FDA and CDC together have proven themselves on this front anyway, that they're really good for picking up rare safety signals like myocarditis, so that if there is any issue, they'll pick it up pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it seems that, parents might ask for more leeway about whether or not they should vaccinate their children. Are we going to see more vaccine mandates like we see coming down the line for schools in LA County? This is really going to be an interesting time when school systems start thinking about mandates.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that vaccine mandates or requirements for schools are very much set at the state level, not at the federal level. And so you're going to see a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of variation. So for instance, here in Texas, where we have a very aggressive anti-vaccine lobby that I go up against all the time, because I have 4 adult kids, including my youngest daughter, Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I wrote this book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, to go up against those groups, and they're pretty aggressive. So in Texas, I doubt that's going to be a huge battle to get any kind of COVID vaccine mandates in place. But in places like California, New England states, maybe New York, I think it'll be much better accepted. And we need that to keep our kids safe, to keep our teachers safe, and to keep school staff safe, and to get kids through the school year. I think it's going to be really important in order to do that. And because otherwise, if you've got a lot of transmission going on, what's going to happen is so many kids are going to get COVID, then they're sent home, and it's really hard to get them through the school year.
Yeah, and I remember that's when we first met, when we were up against anti-vaxxers who were perpetrating the myth that vaccines cause autism, and that was that there's still a number of people, but it seems like there's a different segment of the society now who are anti-vaxxers, and we've been talking about hesitancy a lot among, for example, communities of color, but it seems like that's shifted too, and so we have a lot to deal with. If one thing this pandemic has taught us is that the landscape is constantly changing, and that we have to be very agile and ready to respond to the changing environment. I mean, who would have predicted Delta taking over the way it has as for infection rates?
Well, the anti-vaccine movement has evolved or devolved. When we were fighting those battles a few years ago, it was very much around the false assertion that vaccines cause autism. And we all worked hard to debunk that with big studies showing that kids who got the MMR vaccine, which was the first one alleged, are no more likely to get autism than kids who didn't. And then the anti-vaccine groups kept on shifting the goalpost. Then they said, okay, if it's not an MMR, it must be the thimerosal preservative, or it must be spacing vaccines close together, or alumin vaccines. And each time we debunk that, and then by writing the book, I provided this alternative narrative around the autism genes, and we have more than 100 autism genes. And in the book, I talk about doing whole exome sequencing on Rachel and my wife and I, and identifying a gene that's similar. It's a neuronal cytoskeleton gene, and a lot of them are like that, which makes a lot of sense, talking about synaptic communications and autism. And by diffusing that, though, they just pivoted. So then it became HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers. And they said that that it causes infertility and autoimmunity. And if that sounds familiar for COVID-19 vaccine assertions, that's what they did. They just copy pasted it to COVID-19 vaccines. But the game changer was about 6-7 years ago. In order to re-energize the anti-vaccine groups, made this pivot to political extremism on the right. They glommed onto the Republican Tea Party here in Texas under this sort of phony banner mantra of health freedom, medical freedom. And that's what we're dealing with today. So under health, and that's when they started forming political action committees, started accepting donations from the Republican Tea Party and far right-wing conservative groups. That's when you saw anti-vaccine messages put up on the conservative news outlets. It really ramped up in 2020, 2021, because it glommed onto that, not only protests against vaccines, but masks and social distancing. And now we have this defiance against COVID-19 vaccines in conservative stronghold areas. So it's a strict partisan divide. David Leonhardt in the New York Times, had a terrific article, showing how dramatic that partisan divide is. And for us, this is not easy to talk about, right? All of our training says we don't talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives, but I don't know how to talk about it other than to talk about it. That is the reality. And so we've had now 100,000 Americans lose their lives over the summer, despite the widespread availability of safe and effective vaccines, and almost all of them younger people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, almost all of them in the South, and all of them out of defiance, because the message is to belong to this tribe or this club from the far right means you don't get vaccinated, and or you take ivermectin as a substitute, which does nothing. And it's one of the most self-defeating movements I've ever seen. I don't even call it misinformation or disinformation anymore, Judy. I call it anti-science aggression. This is death by anti-science. And this is why we need organizations like the New York Academy of Medicines to get important information out there and to advocate for science and medicine, and for scientists and physician scientists.
Well, yeah, I think that the trust in science issue is unparalleled in my lifetime, and it's a significant roadblock. I remember as a child lining up at school to get the polio vaccine, and then the Sabin cube I received at church when I went there on Sunday, and the kids all lined up, and there was never a question. Our parents couldn't wait for us to get the vaccine. But I think there's questions certainly about the approval process and the rush of approval with the vaccine, which was something we've heard a lot about from people who are hesitant about, has there been enough time? So is there anything different in the approval process of for a vaccine for children that can maybe help people understand the safety issues for when they're deciding about their children's vaccination?
Well, I think the first part that I do is I explain, well, the vaccines really were not rushed. we began working on coronavirus vaccines a decade ago. So we mainly work on vaccines for diseases of poverty like schistosomiasis and Chagas disease. But about 10 years ago, we saw that coronavirus vaccines were orphaned, and we knew there had already been SARS and MERS, and there was going to be a third major coronavirus pandemic. That's why we started working on it. And we actually collaborated a lot with the New York Blood Center. People like Sarah Lustigman and Shibu Jiang and Lan Yingdu at the New York Blood Center on the Upper East, not far from you, because they had also done a lot of work on coronaviruses, and we began scaling up those vaccines and showed how you deliver the spike protein, how you induce virus neutralizing antibodies, how you formulate them, and their role in protection. All that work, all that R&D work, 10 years with the New York Blood Center, fed into our current COVID-19 vaccines. And I say that because, when you look at the time frame of 10 years or more, that's about the time frame for most vaccine programs. The problem was it was the CEOs of some of the pharma companies, and you know what a press release from a pharma company is like. They're not written for you or for me. They're written for the shareholders, and their intention is to jack up their stock prices and tend to spectacularize their accomplishments. So they put it out there as though they were doing this in a few weeks, and tone deaf to what the impact would be on public health acceptance of those vaccines. And as a result, I do a fair amount of damage control. I got the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. I'm grateful for it. Now I've gotten my third dose, and I think it's really important to do that. But the way the messaging was, it created a lot of concern. And now people, of course, are especially concerned about whether it's safe for their kids. And again, with a very detailed pharmacovigilance study done by, monitoring. So it's not just after the vaccines are approved, whether through emergency use authorization or formally approved. It's not like that's it, adios, we're done. I mean, the FDA and CDC have one of the most careful systems of monitoring the world has ever seen, with multiple systems like the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System and Vaccine Safety Data Link. There's about 3 or 4 or 5 parallel systems in place, so you can be assured that even after the vaccines use for the kids, that this is still going to be followed extremely closely, and we'll get larger numbers. I mean, it is true that these studies are being releasing vaccines only after 3,000 kids, which is still something. But if there's a really rare safety event, you wouldn't pick it up in that. But that's what's going to be picked up. But again, it's being done because of the revelations from the Delta variant of the 30,000 hospitalizations in kids and 500 deaths from COVID-19.
Yeah, this is certainly a long way from the beginning of the pandemic, when we thought kids were immune. There are a very small number of medical exemptions among adults, and I imagine that these would pertain to the younger population as well. So what can we do to help protect those kids who aren't able, for some reason, to take the vaccine when it's available? And what should our schools and our public places do to help that?
Well, it's important to keep in mind there really are very few, very rare medical contraindications to getting COVID-19 vaccines. So, if you've had a really bad allergic reaction and anaphylaxis to the first dose of your vaccine, that might be a contraindication. Or if you have a known severe allergy to any component known to be present in the vaccine, then you don't take it. But there's not many. I mean, there's the polyethylene glycol component, the PEG component. So if you have known PEG severe allergy, and very few people have that or even know they have it. So there are really not many medical indications for not getting vaccinated. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Kids, people who've had Guillain-Barré syndrome or shrimp allergy or something like that. Those are not contraindications, at least at this point, to getting vaccinated. So I have pretty bad shrimp allergy, which, being here on the Gulf Coast, is not fun to have bad shrimp allergy. But but it's not an issue around getting vaccinated.
Yeah, so can we, when we think about the kids, do we know yet about whether or not they will require boosters? Or are we assuming that their immunity will wane over time, or is that yet to be determined?
Well, the kids seem to be responding pretty vigorously, and they're doing it at a lower dose. So my understanding is as Pfizer's applying and as it goes through the process, it'll be for a dose of the vaccine about a third the level that's in the adult or adolescent vaccine. So 30 micrograms, 10 micrograms instead of 30 micrograms. So that's going to be one difference. And the only way I think it's probably likely it'll wane over time. And why do I say that? Well, when these vaccines were first released, it was done 3 weeks apart. We gave that first dose and second dose. And we did that to fully vaccinate the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents quickly. And that was important to do to save a lot of lives. But you would never do that schedule for long lasting and durable infection. So that acts more like a primary immunization. And then 6 months to a later, you boost. I mean, that's the way all of our pediatric vaccines for infants currently work, right? If you remember, you give a series of primary immunizations relatively spaced close apart. You wait 6 months to a year, and then you boost. And it's the same with the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. So from the beginning, I've always said this is going to be a 3-dose vaccine. And sure enough, that's the way it's panning out. Whether that'll be required for kids, we don't know. I'm guessing it probably will, but we'll see.
Can you speculate as to how long it will be before we see approval of vaccination for those under 5, for infants and babies?
Well, for those between 5 and 11, Scott Gottlieb, who's former FDA commissioner on the Pfizer advisory board, says around Halloween. So, sometime after Halloween. Tony Fauci, I think, recently said even before Halloween. So that's for the 5 to 11-year-olds. For the younger kids, I don't know. I'm guessing longer. At this point, I'd be surprised if that happened before the end of 2021. So maybe early next quarter. On the other hand, I'm always surprised by the timelines. They always seem to move faster from the time I predict. But we'll see. And then another question is going to be, how far down do you go in terms of vaccination? Is it going to be like influenza where we vaccinate every kid over the age of 6 months? Or would it be more like measles that you give it at 1 year of age? And we do that because of maternal antibodies to the measles in the mom. It takes time to decline, and you have to wait till that declines. Well, if pregnant women are getting COVID-19 vaccines, and they should, because it's life-saving, that may slow down when you want to the time when you want to vaccinate, or delay the time you want to vaccinate infants. So maybe it'll be given something like a measles vaccine.
So I want to ask one last question that's perhaps a bit unfair, but it's a question I've asked myself. If you had an infant, would you let them participate in a vaccine trial?
I would, but partly because I've been in the system, right? So I'm a vaccine scientist, right? And I've been able to witness all of this firsthand. So for an infant trial, yeah, I would. I have a lot of confidence about the safety of these vaccines, and even our own vaccine. We have a recombinant protein COVID vaccine that we've developed for global health. That's now going to be released for emergency use in India. We hope very soon. The Biological E, our Indian vaccine producers, making 100 million doses a month. This is a low-cost, simple vaccine that looks like it's going to be as good as mRNA vaccines, but for a fraction of the cost. And ease of deliverability. It's similar technology to the hepatitis B vaccine. I wanted to take it myself, but I'd have to go to India to take it, and it just wasn't possible. And I've always wanted to take all the vaccines that we've developed in the clinical trials, and I'm always told it's a conflict of interest. And I just remember when Jonas Salk tested the polio vaccine, he tested it on his kids
Yeah.
first, and I often wonder what that dinner time conversation looked like, but it must have been quite interesting. But so yes, I would if my kids were little, or if I had grandkids, which I'm hoping someday soon, that yeah, I would feel okay enrolling them in a clinical trial.
Thank you for that. And it was good news to hear today about the malaria vaccine as well. You know, vaccines have really changed the picture of public health in this world, and will continue to do so. Do you have any final comments, thoughts?
Well, I'll say this about the malaria vaccine. You know, that was first developed in New York, of course, at NYU by Ruth and Victor Nussenswag. That was where the antigen was first really discovered and cloned and expressed, the circumsporozoite antigen. And they were doing the malaria vaccine downtown. I was up at Rockefeller and University, and Tony Cerami's lab as an MD PhD student developing a hookworm vaccine. And our hookworm vaccine that I started as an MD PhD student 40 years ago in the 80s is now in phase 2 clinical trials. So that's very exciting as well. So I hope, you know, these parasites are tough vaccine targets, much tougher than viruses. So hopefully that can materialize as well. But just to say thank you, and you know, the New York is such a rich place, not only culturally but for biomedical sciences, and it's wonderful that the New York Academy of Medicine is really taking on providing appropriate medically important, scientifically important information about the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, that's why we have a New York Academy of Medicine. You're just doing a terrific job getting the word out there.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. We know how busy you are, and thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you again.
I hope you enjoyed the program today. And let's ask ourselves, what can I do? First, we can all learn the facts and take action with what you've learned today. Click the link at the end of the program for resources and information that we've gathered for you, and share this information in your places of work, among your networks, and through social media. So thank you for joining us. We'll be around with our next Around the Table later this year. I want to encourage everyone once again to take action. Thank you and goodbye.